and welcome to the third meeting of the Health and Sport Committee in 2021. We have received apologies this morning from Alex Cole-Hamilton. Can I ask all witnesses and members please to ensure that mobile phones are silent and that all other notifications are turned off during the meeting. The first item on our agenda today is a one-off evidence session on the Scottish Trauma Network, and I welcome to the committee Dr. Martin McKechnie, National Clinical Lead for the Scottish Trauma Network, James Anderson, Lead Clinician, North of Scotland Trauma Network, Michael Donald, Lead Clinician, East of Scotland, Edward Dunstan, Lead Clinician, South East of Scotland, Dr. Ian Wallace, Interim Lead Clinician, West of Scotland Trauma Network, and Peter Lindell, Consultant Paramedic in Major Trauma with the Scottish Ambulance Service. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you for the comprehensive report and information you provided to the committee in advance of today's meeting. We will move straight to questions. I will start with the first question, which will be for Martin McKechnie, and I will invite members to ask additional questions in turn. Can I ask witnesses, please, to, if you wish to respond or contribute to the discussion, and I haven't called you for that particular question, please enter an R in the chat box to indicate that you wish to be called. Can we start, Martin McKechnie, looking back to the origins of the Trauma Network, and I refer to the GEOS study published in 2015. That suggested major trauma centres only in Glasgow and Edinburgh, whereas in fact it is Aberdeen and Dundee which have led the way and where the trauma centres are now up and running. Does that mean that the GEOS report got it wrong in all major respects? Martin McKechnie.
No, I don't think it means it got it wrong at all. I think a lot of decisions were made based on the GEOS study, and then that was obviously reviewed, and the members of the committee will know a lot about the processes that took place before a political decision was announced to set up the 4 major trauma centres. And I would sort of add that many of the people on my team that are with you today, we were all appointed subsequent to that. These were decisions, if you like, made before the actual trauma network was set up to be implemented and to carry out the conclusions, both of the GEOS study, the clinical academic studies, and also the political decisions about where trauma centres and trauma units would be located. So to answer your question, I think that a lot of other considerations came into place based on what was available at the time in terms of movement of patients across the country, and also perhaps based upon infrastructure available in Scotland at the time, and something which we in the Trauma Network have tried to progress and move on by creating the network and creating far more cross-boundary working. I think one of the major factors about translating the GEOS study into clinical practice is geography and weather and distance. Scotland is very interesting. It's very almost unique actually across the world in terms of its population distribution, concentrations, as well as in remote and rural and island communities. So we have set quite high standards in trying to get optimal trauma care to patients at the roadside, and also all the way through their care pathway into rehabilitation, which again is quite a new approach to trauma care. It's not something that has been done around the world to the same extent that we are doing it. And that may sound a little bit bullish and ambitious, but I think it's important. The reasons that trauma centres are located where they are is really to try to create a system of multiple specialties, which has now translated into a multi-specialty system. And by that, I mean it was really not joined up in the same way that we're trying to achieve it right now. So both by collaborating across territorial and geographical boundaries and also across specialty boundaries, which did not happen before, I think that the GEOS study has presented us with information about where and what happens and how it happens, but the Trauma Network has taken that on to provide the best care, whether that happens in an urban centre or whether that happens in a remote and rural area. My final point about that would be to say that I think this is an ongoing and a moving battlefield. I would not be surprised if there were changes, in the future about where services are located and how they are delivered. Certainly in the last 3 years of our involvement within delivering trauma care in Scotland, things have changed markedly. So the GEO study was a very, very important leading study, and we are presented with 4 major trauma centres, which is our ambition to deliver the final pieces of that jigsaw in the next few months.
Thank you very much. So in fact, it's a very interesting answer. In a sense, you're saying rather than there being a fault in what was originally proposed, you're saying you've actually gone well beyond that, and you're working in a way across boundaries in a way that perhaps wasn't envisaged 5 or 6 years ago. What does that mean, given the major trauma centres are at the pinnacle of the structure as originally envisaged and indeed as delivered? Will the coming on stream of 2 further major trauma centres in Glasgow and Edinburgh, will that affect the throughput of patients in the existing centres in Aberdeen and Dundee? And will that have any impact on the expertise available in the major trauma centres in Aberdeen and Dundee?
The answer is yes and no. I hope I'll explain that. There are a relatively small number of major trauma patients every year in Scotland. If we talk about trauma in its entirety, we're talking several thousands, say 6,000 patients, of which major, serious, severe injury may account for beyond 1,000 of those, maybe up to 1,500. They are incredibly complex patients. They are what we call multi-system, so you'll understand that can be a head injury as well as a neck injury, a chest injury, etc., etc. So there are lots of surgical and clinical areas of expertise that require very specialist care if we are to deliver what we want to deliver in terms of the optimal patient care and rehabilitation for these patients. That is an ongoing and long-term benefit to Scottish society. Therefore, it is right that we invest heavily upfront in trying to deal with these patients as quickly as possible, as closely as possible to their location of accident or injury. And that's why the trauma centres are spread out across the country. Again, I go back to geography, and you'll understand that in the last couple of years we've seen extremes of meteorology and climate difficulties, and that's part of the thinking behind placing hospitals and trauma centres and services where they are. And we can go on to that in greater detail if you wish in due course. The answer to your question, there will be a small number of patients who will necessarily be taken from trauma units, which is the step down hospital from a major trauma centre, but it's still very well equipped to deal with most trauma injury. But the most serious stuff will go to the major trauma centres. And on occasion, there may be a requirement, excuse me, for certain multi or polytrauma patients to be moved perhaps from one trauma centre to another. And these would be for significant injuries alongside neurosurgery perhaps, or paediatric care, or burns care, or what we call orthoplastic care, which is a combination of orthopedics and plastic and reconstructive surgery. So they are by necessity based perhaps only in one hospital in Scotland. So you'll understand that if I am in Aberdeen perhaps and I have a surgical issue that requires transfer from the initial reception at the Royal Infirmary in Aberdeen, it may need me to go to perhaps another centre for ongoing burns care, for example. And we almost saw that in August of last year when the train crash happened on the line from Aberdeen to Glasgow. Luckily, of course, there were a few people on the train, and sadly there were deaths, but that could have been a whole lot worse. And part of the planning for that was about making sure that we were able to transfer and transport certain types of patients across regional and health board boundaries to the place where they would get the best, quickest, optimal treatment based on their injuries. I hope that explains or answers your question.
It does, absolutely. But I guess the other aspect I was wondering about was whether there is an optimal number of patients, an optimal level of throughput that is appropriate for maintaining skills and expertise in major trauma centres, and if so, how does that compare with the numbers you've described?
Well, yes, there is an optimal number, and the centres that we have available will deal with those optimal numbers. A lot of the answer to the ongoing part of that question will be on the data as it comes out in the coming years. it won't be easy to tell you that story right away. And also, in years gone by, we perhaps haven't had completeness of information to allow us to benchmark that as in a detailed a way as we would always have liked. But that is because of the complexity of individual patient distribution of injury and patterns of care required. That is required perhaps to be delivered in areas out with their own regional home territory, if you like, and the area of reception of their local trauma centres and trauma units. So the answer to your question, I think, will come in years once we get full reflection of data, once the network is fully up and running. And I hope you appreciate that although behind the scenes we are ready to be activated as a national trauma network, there are still one or two pieces of that jigsaw still to be completed, which has been slightly scuppered over the last year by additional pressures, of course, that we all know about, caused by the difficulties in staff redeployment and recruitment and demands made upon health services. So I think that story will come out, but I think we're already on the right path. I think we've got some unpublished data, which I can't really share with you at the moment, but that will come in very quick course once the trauma network is fully established and running.
Thank you very much. And on that theme, we'll move on to the next question from Sandra White. And as I say, I remind witnesses, if anyone wants to chip into a particular question, just put an R in the chat box to indicate that. Sandra White.
Thank you very much, Convener, and good morning, gentlemen. Following on from the Convener's questions, I've got two questions particularly to ask, and that's in regarding to Glasgow and Edinburgh trauma centres, which are not operational yet. Obviously, as a constituency MSP in Kelvin, I'm particularly interested in the Glasgow situation. And we know that the initial recommendations were obviously Aberdeen and Dundee are open as a trauma centre, and I note the fact that previous witness had mentioned that there's lots of cross-boundary working, and Glasgow and Edinburgh were to be operational in 2021. Now, this morning, or last night I think it was, we received a letter from the Cabinet Secretary, the committee did, and if you would just bear with me, and a couple of paragraphs I'd like to read out to you from the Cabinet Secretary. The Cabinet Secretary mentions in her letter that obviously we're aware about the major trauma centres in the West and South East, not yet officially opened. And while both the West and South East continue to treat and care for trauma patients through existing pathways, the expectations would be that they'd be initially started up the trauma in 2021 and going live and supported by the trauma triage tool. However, due to the ongoing pressures, and I think you've already mentioned it, the previous witness, about training, but also about COVID, and I noticed in your submission that in Dundee, in Ninewells Hospital, one of the wards that you had used for the trauma centre had to be turned into a high dependency unit because of COVID in that respect. So see, it's having an effect there in Dundee also, basically. But what the Cabinet Secretary says, while both areas can be reverted back to the original purpose, that's the COVID-19 patients in the wards, it would be retracting critical COVID-19 capacity and as a result applying further pressures to other parts of the service. Now, I just wanted to ask the two questions. I'll just combine them together. Would you agree with the Cabinet Secretary's explanation of why the trauma centres are not opened yet in Glasgow and Edinburgh? And if you have any other issues you want to raise in regards to that, I'd be pleased to hear them. And the second question, which I'll combine just now, is if the delay in opening Edinburgh and Glasgow, does that have any effect on trauma cases in the Aberdeen and Dundee, or any effect in the care in the west and south east of the country? So
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Perhaps come first to Ian Wallace, Interim Lead Clinician in the West of Scotland. Ian Wallace.
Yeah. Thanks very much. Yes, first of all, I think it's disappointing that we haven't been able to open as planned in March. However, I think everyone understands the reasons for that, and the Cabinet Secretary has laid that out in the letter. We hope to keep on top of all of this, and of course we're kind of ready to go. And as soon as things appear to be in control, then we will begin the process of opening the centres. It's been quite a challenging time with COVID. Staff have been moved to deal with COVID cases. I think establishing the major trauma centre ward in Queen Elizabeth in those situations is difficult because at the moment it's a high dependency area, as you mentioned earlier, for medical patients. But we are in many circumstances ready to go. There are some capital bill changes that have been a bit delayed. There have been some appointments as well, just with COVID again, be able to put people in place. But you know, most of it that is all there. I'd also reassure you that we're working as a network in the West anyway, as colleagues are across Scotland. So people are meeting, discussing cases. We meet monthly, a clinical governance meeting where we discuss the cases, and I guess our aim is to improve the quality of care even without a major trauma centre being open. So things have moved along quite a pace, and things I think are better than they were a few years, even though we haven't got this sort of MTC open yet at the moment.
Thank you very much. And Edward Dunstan from South East of Scotland.
Yes, so again, we in the South East are very disappointed that we are unable to open. But just to absolutely reassure every member of the committee, we have made such significant progress over the past 4 years when it comes to dealing with major trauma patients. Ian's talked about the robust clinical governance processes we have in place. We have morbidity and mortality meetings. We have standardised paperwork. We still adhere to the key performance indicators, which we may well hear about later. And there's lots of shared learning. Each region produces its own newsletters. We feed off each other. We have regular meetings, clinical, non-clinical. And we have appointed a very large number of staff to support the process. So, for instance, at the Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh, we've appointed 6 ED consultants. These are emergency care consultants, which now means you have 24/7 senior doctor front door coverage, which we never had before. To open as a major trauma centre, there are some minimum requirements that we do need to attain. And as Ian already talked about, one of those is a major trauma ward. And a major trauma ward is where all of your critically injured patients go. They're all cohorted together, where they are cared and looked after by appropriately trained, skilled and supported members of the healthcare team. Physiotherapists, pain specialists, psychologists, nurses, doctors, and doctors across a whole ream of specialties. Before the major trauma network was even considered, these patients were scattered around the hospital. They might be on a general surgery ward, an orthopaedic ward, a medical ward. But now we need to put these patients into one area where we have appropriate skills and expertise. And the proposed major trauma ward at the Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh, unfortunately, is a COVID assessment area, which would be an inappropriate place to place these critically injured patients. And as Ian's already mentioned, you know, we've despite having this COVID pandemic, we have still managed to proceed, and the teams work so hard. We've still managed to appoint to all the necessary positions. So from a staffing point of view, we're ready to go in March. And we've had to completely change the way we've done educational and training. It's all gone online. All of our M&M meetings, it's all online now, but it still works. And this is something we did not have in 2017. So major trauma cases are still being dealt in a much better way than what they were in 2017. But you're absolutely right. Any delay to opening will be at the detriment to major trauma care. There's no getting away from it. But I can assure you, in the region, we are still doing everything we possibly can to make sure that these individuals are treated effectively. And, you know, people might think because of the COVID pandemic, people not driving cars, that there's not as much major trauma around. It's not the case at all. We've hardly seen a fall off. People are injuring themselves in different ways. I mean, recently, tobogganing. So we are dealing with it in the best way we can. And it is disappointing. And there's no question in my mind we will open this year at all. And the team is ready to go.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Can I just come in?
Yes, of course, Sandra. Yeah.
Sorry, I just want to thank the witnesses and obviously the good work that they're doing, all of the staff as well. And a note in regards to the ambulance service, I didn't know if Peter Lindell wanted to come in. The trauma triage tool has to have the ambulance service, but it's not operational in the West and the East. Is that correct?
Peter Limpel.
Hello, Sandra. Yep, thanks for the question. That's correct, yes. The triage tool is what our frontline staff are going to use to make decisions about where best to take patients for their care, whether it be a local emergency hospital, a trauma unit or a trauma centre. So clearly we can't start using that tool until all the trauma centres are open and are an option to us, which is why it hasn't gone live in the West and the East yet. Sorry, South East.
Okay. Thank you very much for that. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. And now call on Emma Harper.
Convener, good morning to everybody and thanks for being here this morning. I'm interested in how COVID has affected trauma, and in this submission from the Scottish Trauma Network, it says that trauma has continued throughout the pandemic with some changes in presentations and changes in numbers during periods of lockdown, and clinicians across the country continue to respond to trauma calls alongside management of COVID patients. And it says, like, I would assume that certain types of trauma would reduce during lockdown, like road traffic accidents. So I'm interested in whether the witnesses think that major trauma cases were largely unchanged, while other types of trauma were affected by restrictions. And I do need to remind everybody, or remind colleagues and witnesses, of my prior experience as an operating room trauma nurse when I worked in Los Angeles. So I'm interested to hear how COVID has affected trauma and the types of trauma in Scotland.
Thank you very much. Perhaps ask James Anderson from the North of Scotland network to respond to that question. James.
Yes, I agree with the comments that have been made before, and with Martin's comments as well. I think in the North, the numbers have continued in absolute terms, largely unchanged in terms of major trauma admissions, but it is the type. So because people are spending more time at home, we've seen more, during the first lockdown, we saw more injuries in domestic settings. So that would be falls from height, falls from domestic tasks. Unfortunately, the clinical impression is also of an increase in injuries related to alcohol and to a degree self-harm as well, which I suspect is an indication of the levels of distress that some people are experiencing. Road traffic accidents were still occurring, potentially again a clinical impression rather than the numbers. It's difficult to be sure statistically, but the impression from the network was potentially accidents involving multiple people perhaps had dropped down a bit because people were perhaps travelling individually with rather than multiple occupants of a car, and certainly general trauma in this lockdown as well. We've still seen degree of road traffic accidents, and of course in the north of Scotland with ice and necessary travel as well with the geography, we still see admissions ongoing currently.
Thank you very much. Emma Harper.
Thanks for that. I'm assuming that there have been some challenges during the pandemic in order to engage and manage the network. And recently, I know NHS Dumfries and Galloway had issues with the slips and trips and fractures because of the weather, and obviously that would impact the ability to manage COVID numbers as well. Are you able to describe what some of the challenges have been during the pandemic?
Thanks. James, carry on.
Sorry, I'm happy to continue with a little bit of that. Yes, I think in COVID in general, there is the ward pressures and staff pressures as we've had to reorganise within the hospital, and I think as in our report, there's been a degree of cross support to ICU and HDU and so forth as needed as well as certainly the slip, trips and falls aspect of things has added a little bit of pressure. as well at the A&E side of things.
Thank you. Martin McKechnie.
Yes, thank you, Convener. What has been shown in recent submissions of data towards the Scottish Trauma Network is that, interestingly, very major trauma has increased. There has been a sort of status quo or a slight reduction in what we would call less severe trauma. And the reasons for that are behaviourally interesting, because clearly we've been in lockdown, or various degrees of lockdown over recent months. But there is evidence that shows that severe trauma, in terms of road traffic accidents and leisure-related activities, have increased. One of the other areas that has increased is, sadly, domestic violence and mental health-related self-inflicted violence, but also violence against others. So within this melange, this pudding of trauma patients, we are seeing patterns developing that major trauma has actually increased during the pandemic. And because perhaps shielding or elderly patients aren't quite out and about as much as they were before, that has remained static, if slightly less. So there has been a changing demographic within that, and I might suggest Peter Lindell come in on that, given the pre-hospital aspects of transfer and treatment at the roadside.
Peter Lindell.
Thank you, Martin. I suppose just thinking about the slips, trips and falls, which, as you say, we're still seeing a lot of, especially in the last few weeks with the weather. The investment from the trauma network is really helping us to better deal with these, despite the fact that we don't have the full network running yet. So, for example, we can now give antibiotics to people with open fractures, which is a new thing for the ambulance service and is evidence to improve outcomes for patients. We have better splinting. We have advanced paramedics who can now go out, advanced practitioners who can now go out and better look after these complicated fractures, so that when they go into the emergency department, they're already adequately analgesied, reduced, packaged, and really make the job a bit easier for the ED. And these things are happening just now thanks to the investment that we've put in. Like I say, despite the fact that we're not fully operational yet. So I guess that would be my perspective on that, Martin.
Thank you very much. And Ian Wallace.
Yeah, just another small point around COVID and just the investment that's already been made in major trauma centres. Regional anaesthesia is, avoidance of general anaesthesia in people with limb injuries, and certainly in the West we've been able to invest a bit in that. So there's now 24/7 availability of that, which then reduces the need for general anaesthesia, and that is a risk factor in terms of COVID, in terms of staff. So just another benefit.
Thank you very much. Emma Harper.
Thanks for that. I was going to actually ask Peter Lindell to talk about new ways of working, and you've described some of them already. And I think it is really important to hear about pre-hospital or treatment in advance, so that we can help have better outcomes for patients. So I'd be interested to hear about that, any expansion on new ways of working. And a final question would be about what was described as by Edward Dunstan, as in, you mentioned that you fed off each other in the trauma network to learn from each other. I'm interested in, as well as new ways of working, are we learning from other countries that have rural challenges as well, like Canada, Alaska, Australia? Australia have a rural health commissioner. So are we also working with other countries to see how they manage things?
In fact, that question might be ideally suited for James Anderson to kick off with, but I also want to hear from Michael Donald in the East Network as well. James Anderson.
Yes, we do have some of those links. We were looking at some the preliminary some projects with one of the Australian groups who did a lot of remote medicine follow-up. One of our consultants in Raigmore as well worked remotely in Australia as well. So I think those, and we had a group from Norway visit as well. So I think we are trying to learn from other people's experience, but also, as Martin said before, the geography and the task of creating the network in the north of Scotland as well. I do feel quite quietly proud that we're also trying to lead the way a little bit as well, and certainly thinking about COVID and I think the flexibility, because again, Edward was mentioning the degree of things that have been done virtually. I think we've, despite all of that, with the investment of the network, we've really tried to push forward in continuing contact with the people that we care for, and irrespective of geography, both and again, I'd always defer to pre-hospital for Peter, but at both pre-hospital and discharge at the other end as well.
Thank you. Michael Donald, followed by Martin McKechnie. Michael Donald.
Lewis, thank you very much. And Emma, thank you very much for the questions. If I could perhaps rewind to address one of the points that you raised relevant to your prior experience working in the operating theatre environment and the challenges that COVID has presented to us in running a major trauma service in COVID times, is that of the requirement for adequate PPE for the major trauma team that are now assembling to manage these patients at the front door of the hospital, and equally as relevant to Peter's ambulance service colleagues also, in that the additional complexities of having to don aerosol generating procedure PPE, receive patients that are going to require critical care interventions, has actually produced quite a significant strain on the system that we have developed, whereby prior to the inception of the major trauma service, a lot of these patients would be managed just by an A&E team that would then contact colleagues within the hospital, so specialist colleagues, to come down and deal with the patient depending on what their injury load may be. Whereas what we have done, certainly in the east of Scotland, is now assembled a multidisciplinary team that will be available at the front door of the hospital to manage these patients. And as the trauma team leader, in order to protect the team and provide them with adequate PPE to receive these patients, we've had to be quite creative in how we have managed those numbers at the front door of the hospital to receive those patients. And that has been one of the significant effects of COVID, particularly in the first wave, where we actually elected to reduce the number of individuals that would be in this aerosol generating PPE to initially receive the patients. And we have learned a lot from that initial first lockdown, to being able to get back to a point where actually we can put all of the necessary specialists wrapped around that major trauma patient safely and continue to deliver that seamless care from the roadside through to rehabilitation whilst protecting our staff. And I thought, Emma, that would be quite relevant to you and your experience within the theatre environment also, and how important it is that the team feel safe in the environment they're working in. The second point about the remote and rural medicine, I worked in New South Wales and Australia on a rescue helicopter doing this type of work about 15 years ago, and there is no doubt that the Australasians were 20 years ahead of us in the UK at that time in terms of major trauma management. And I'm really pleased to say that the developments that we have seen in Scotland, I think, now surpass those that have been available to the public in Australasia for many, many years, in that although that they have a very high-end, high-level care system, it's very much devolved to within their regions. So New South Wales and Queensland, the borders don't have a huge amount of cross-pollination, whereas in Scotland, the way that the network has been developed has been across all geopolitical boundaries. And we're at a stage now where wherever you end up experiencing major trauma, wherever that may be in Scotland, the network will now assume that responsibility for that individual and work so hard in order to wrap that care around the patient. And that can't be said for the entirety of Australia, the entirety of New Zealand, whereas I think we can be very proud in Scotland to say that that's what we are moving very closely towards, and that's what the outcome of this will be, hopefully by the end of this year.
Thank you very much. Martin McKechnie, followed by Edward Dunstan.
Thank you, Convener. And just to add to Emma, to your question, I was actually going to suggest Michael speak about what he's just spoken about. So I'm glad he has done, so I won't go back to that. But his experience internationally and his reflections on what's happened here are telling, I would say, and important to hear. The extension to what Michael had said is that internationally, to address your point specifically, and I'm getting a lot of echo here, so forgive me if I'm sounding stilted, but we have had visits from teams in Norway. We have presented at meetings in New Zealand and in Denmark, and we have been visited, if you like, and queried on how we're setting things up by organisations from government and health care in Qatar and Philadelphia. And so I would suggest that the balance of information flow is actually surprisingly opposite. It goes along with what Michael said, is that people are asking us, how are you doing this? And I think that's quite important for the kudos and the prestige of the network, but also the way it's been set up in Scotland.
Thank you very much. Edward Dunstan, followed by Peter Lindell. Edward Dunstan.
Yeah, so I'll be quite brief, as a lot of what I was going to say is already mentioned, but just to absolutely reassure, there is a huge amount of shared learning. All the trauma units, the major trauma centres, they have their own little morbidity, mortality meetings where they discuss difficult cases. We have regional meetings where we discuss these cases in more depth. And then we have national meetings as well, when again, we discuss these cases in more depth. We produce quality improvement newsletters with shared learning points, what could have been done better, what went particularly well. From the southeast, and I know it's the same with other regions, we visited trauma centres in Nottingham, in St George's. We have colleagues working in the southeast who still part of their job contract is to work in major trauma centres out with Scotland. So there is this flow to and from, and as Martin and the team, who, by the way, set up some excellent national days that we have every year prior to COVID, where we have guest speakers from all parts of the world, again, giving us our top tips and what are the quick wins, what are the low-lying fruit that we can pick and make a real change to patient care. So be absolutely reassured, there is a huge amount of shared learning, and the regional and national clinical governance structures that we have that didn't exist before have made a huge difference.
Thank you. Peter Lindell.
Thank you, Lewis. Just to go back to answer Emma's original question, or a bit of it, the changes we're seeing pre-hospital are detailed in the paper we submitted. So we've got 3 levels of response to major trauma patients. But to answer the second part of your question, the key thing we learned from Australasian models was the need for clinical coordination of these assets. So, you know, to get past the geographical boundaries and the challenges of working around mountains and lochs and in Scotland, you need someone at the centre of everything and making sure that these very limited resources get direct to the patients who need the most, which is why, as I say, the key thing we learned from other areas of the world was that you need someone in our control centres pointing these assets at the right people. And that's why we've invested quite heavily in the trauma desk model of clinical coordination. And I guess the big benefit we've seen, or the big change really for me as a paramedic, is that through the network and the relationships we've built up with the people who are on this call today, we are for the first time receiving feedback on our performance with regards to looking after our trauma patients, and that's made a massive change. And I think that's the thing that's going to see us make big improvements in trauma care pre-hospitally, is just those relationships that we didn't have before.
Thank you very much. I now call Donald Cameron.
Convener, and good morning to all the witnesses. I had some questions around pre-hospital care, but many of the answers have already covered that in terms of what the main changes have been. I just had one remaining question on that, which is how is the standard of pre-hospital care assessed? How do you sort of grade it, as it were?
Peter Lyndall, perhaps to start with at least, and then perhaps Martin McKechnie as well. Peter Lyndall.
Thank you. Thanks for the question, Donald. Well, as Martin said at the start, I guess the way we will ultimately grade the quality of the pre-hospital care we've delivered is on feedback from the major trauma centres and the relationships we have with them. When we bring patients in, there'll be expectations about how they've been looked after and packaged, which medications they've been given. And if that hasn't met the required standard, then we'll hear of that through our various governance meetings and through feedback from our major trauma centre colleagues. Obviously, we have our own suites of internal measures that are in their infancy, but the main things that are important to us in trauma care, I suppose, is identifying the things that are potentially killing our patients and treating those as quickly and effectively as they can. We know from evidence that the things that tend the reasons we tend to lose people in pre-hospital scenarios are things like bleeding, chest injuries, major head injuries. So a lot of the investment we've made into trauma care, particularly at the sort of green level, at the paramedic level, is in equipment and medications that can address those issues. So better splints and tourniquets to stop bleeding. We have pre-hospital medical teams that can go out and give patients blood at the side of the road now, which is a completely new thing. We have advanced practitioners who can go out and give adequate analgesia for trauma patients over and above what we could give before. We can address chest injuries performing surgical procedures that previously could only have been provided in an emergency department. We can now go out and provide those at the side of the road. So really, as I say, in answer to your question, how we measure how effective pre-hospital care is will be on feedback from our major trauma centre colleagues, and that's why the idea of the network is so important, because that's how we'll gauge the effectiveness of our work, I suppose.
Thank you.
We'll back to your question.
Yes, Edward Dunstan, followed by James Anderson.
Yes, again, just to say the Scottish Ambulance Service are an absolutely key part of our family, of our team, so that every regional clinical governance meeting we have, there is a representative there. The patients that are chosen to be discussed, they have warning about, and we are able to go through a patient's journey all the way from that first 999 call, and sometimes we even hear the recordings of those phone calls at these meetings. And we are able to support and offer peer review of the decisions that were made. So was that patient transferred to the major trauma centre to be by land or by air? Did they bypass the local trauma unit? And everything is broken down into time slots. And so we are able to offer peer support and critique to see if anything could have been done better. And that would be one of the learning points that if there were things that could be changed, that will be one of the learning points that we would share through our quality improvement newsletters, which we would share amongst the whole region and also discuss nationally as well. So they are critical, and we support each other. And as I said, there is critique when it is required.
James Anderson, followed by Martin McKechnie.
I just wanted to, on the pre-hospital note and the changes and the improvements with the Scottish Ambulance Service through the network, I think the feedback from the remote and rural hospitals in the LEH has been that these changes have been revolutionary, in so much as having that single point of contact, critical care desk, the ability to reach expertise and support for what in some rural places are still relatively infrequent events. And I've had a number of senior clinicians in the islands and Caithness and so forth speak very highly of where they used to make literally many phone calls to arrange care and seek advice. There is now a network, so they have one point to contact and that I think that has been a huge benefit to pre-hospital care and then the initial staging into hospitals as well.
Thank you very much. Martin McKechnie, followed by Ian Wallace.
Thank you, Convener. So, Donald, just to take your question a little bit further, in addition to that governance aspect that you've heard about from Peter and Ed, it's important that you understand that the Scottish Trauma Audit Group absolutely scrutinise and indeed sometimes feels like we're persecuted by them about improving our quality and assuring that quality. So STAG feed into us externally, so that's the Scottish Trauma Audit Group, and they look at patients who stay 3 days in hospital or more as a result of trauma. What we're trying to do is extend that remit out into general information governance. So we have appointed an information manager to look into other areas of trauma, such as the Department of Work and Pensions, the Procurator Fiscal's Office, the Police Fire Services, and indeed the Crown Office if it crosses borders into England and beyond. So we're trying to get all the data to get the whole picture to answer your specific question. And just to take that one little bit further, you'll have seen from our submission links to both STAG and to the trauma app. And the app is something we're developing to give a much higher standard of recording, but also safety governance, quality improvement and quality assurance. So I think all these things coming together will create a far more robust structure of governance and safety for patients, and also quality assured performance of all the constituent staff components of the network. And the final point on that is that evidence would suggest that if you do all the things well that Peter Lindell has described and that Ed has described, then we're probably looking at a 30 to 40% reduction of deaths in hospital. By that I mean, if we improve the pre-hospital care, by the time the patient gets to their definitive care in the trauma unit or the major trauma centre or even the local emergency hospital, then, you know, a third or more of patients who previously died will not. And accompanying that is a well-expected reduction in length of hospital stay. So the bang for buck here is important to me and important to you, I'm sure, but it's based on improving the clinical care that's provided from the minutes after the accident or the injury.
Ian Wallace.
Very quickly, I was going to mention STAG, which has been great. I think the clinicians are really involved in the data and looking for improvement. I think the other thing was just to say about the culture of the network, which is very much supportive. There is some constructive challenge going on, which is good, but it really is about working together. And I think without the network, that wouldn't exist. So a quality improvement focus.
Donald Cameron.
Thank you for those answers and very comprehensive from everyone. Can I move on to ask about the issue of transfer times? We know that trauma systems work to an optimum transfer time threshold of about 45 minutes. This may seem a somewhat obvious question, but how important is it to get patients to a trauma unit within 45 minutes? And what proportion of patients were transferred within that timetable?
Peter Lindell.
Thank you, Donald. I suppose the evidence around the exact timing of that, the 45 minutes, is not particularly strong. You'll see in some of the English networks have recently expanded that to 60 minutes. I guess that's our starting point, and we'll be looking to use the network to assess whether that time limit is correct and maybe extend it as they have down south. As to your question as to how many people have been transferred within the time, that was something I would need to go and have a look at and come back to you on if that's all right. But happy to submit some data on that to the clerk of the committee.
Thank you very much. Donald Cameron.
Thank you very much. My final question is again on the issue of transfer times. We know that 14% of the Scottish population are out with the 45-minute threshold to an MTC, and 7% of the population are unable to reach an MTC or a trauma unit within 45 minutes. And there are many of us, I think, on this committee who represent rural communities who may be particularly affected by that. What is being done to mitigate against longer transfer times for those members of the population who are unable to reach a unit or an MTC within 45 minutes?
Peter Lyndall.
Thank you, Lewis. Donald, to answer the question, absolutely recognise the challenge of having a population, such a large part of the population living in remote communities and islands. What we've done to address those challenges is put together our ScotStar teams, which you'll be aware of. We've just put a new one in as part of the work of the Trauma Network in the north of Scotland. The idea being that for those that can't make it to a major trauma centre or a trauma unit within the ideal time frame, we can effectively use one of our ScotStar consultant-led retrieval teams to bring the ED to them. So a lot of the interventions that you would expect to get in the first few minutes of arriving at a major trauma centre, we can actually provide by sending one of these teams out by helicopter or by fixed-wing aircraft to the patient. Whether they be in a district general hospital in an island or even a remote GP surgery, we can send those consultant-led teams out to effectively take the care to the patient. And of course, making use of our air assets, which we're very lucky to have in Scotland, our two funded air ambulances, our charity air ambulance colleagues who support us in that as well. As I say, our fixed-wing aircraft, we can use those to kind of cut that time frame down. And I guess the final point would be, as I mentioned before, clinical coordination. So identifying people who need that type of help as quickly as possible by having clinicians listen in to 999 calls as they arrive, and then making sure that these assets that we have at our disposal are tasked as quickly as possible, and minimising the delay in getting those patients to where they need to be.
Martin McKechnie.
Thank you, Donald. Peter's answered pretty much what I was going to say, but I would just add a little bit to that. We took a conscious decision at the core group, which was ratified by our steering group of the network, not to go to 60 minutes. We challenged ourselves to deliver the 45-minute standard, and that is currently being measured, and we will report on that in due course. It's unpublished data. Once the network's fully established, then we'll be able to report on that. But your point is very well made. We will bring the expertise to the patient, and a development in that sense has been ScotStar North. And that has also involved collaboration with the Scottish Charity Air Ambulance. So we now have, both fixed-wing and rotary assets based in the north at Aberdeen Airport, which didn't happen before. And we also have the augmented PICT team at Rigmore Hospital in Inverness, which has a range and a capability for a lot of roadside accidents up in your neck of the woods. And support from the trauma desk and the ScotStar teams will aim to deliver care in that critical time window where we know that the most severe injuries cause the most damage unless they're managed immediately. My final point is that we have collaborated within our pre-hospital group with both the basics service of advanced trained general practitioners in remote and rural communities, as well as the Sandpiper Trust. So they are part of our ongoing education system to deliver augmented roadside care until such time as we either transfer the patient to the appropriate facility or the RED team comes to the patient.
Thank you. And just for clarity, Martin, or certainty, when you say a decision was reached to stick with the 45-minute target rather than going to 60, I take it that was on clinical grounds.
It was on clinical grounds based on perhaps more urban environments, but we see this as a lever to improve pre-hospital care across the whole of Scotland. So the job we've been tasked with is to deliver equity of care, whether you're in Orkney or Dumfries or Stornoway, the borders, as well as the urban central belt.
Thank you very much. And there were brief further responses from Edward Dunstan, followed by James Anderson. Edward.
Yeah, I mean, Martin's got it on the nose there. It's equity of care. It doesn't matter where you live in Scotland, you should have access to exactly the same resource as someone else. In the southeast, we are an urban trauma network. What does that mean? It means the vast majority of our patients are within 45 minutes. But to reassure the committee, it's not only a major trauma centre that has minimum requirements, it's also the trauma units themselves. So the trauma units can still supply a significantly high level of care for these critically injured patients if that need required. And it has required investment in the trauma units in the form of staffing, training. So for instance, one of the minimum requirements is that in a trauma unit, you have to be able to open a chest of a critically injured patient, which is essentially extremist life-saving surgery. So those skills have been disseminated. There's a minimum requirement for the nursing and the doctors, the seniority of doctors, and also the amount of time that key specialists need to be able to get to that emergency department. So it's about networks. It's not just about the major trauma centre. It's about upskilling the trauma units in case they do have to deal with these patients. We've also worked very hard nationally on hot transfers. You've got to remember that up to 20% of people who are critically injured will self-present to a hospital, a trauma unit. They will not be picked up by the Scottish Ambulance Service. So we've worked really hard nationally on protocols about how to get these patients that might be unstable in ED to go from ED to ED. And you heard earlier on from James, I think, that before you'd have to pick up the phone, you'd have to call all these different people, all these different specialties to accept the patients. That's not the case when the network goes live. There is a single point of contact. If a trauma unit calls up a major trauma centre, there will be no denying that patient being transferred. They will be put in an ambulance with the appropriate staff, and they will get to that major trauma centre in a very timely manner. So just to reassure, our trauma units are also very capable of dealing with major trauma patients.
James Anderson.
Much has already been said. Thank you, Convener. It was just the point both through our governance process. There's been a couple of incidents identified of late where one of the crucial things was either the red team or PICT being able to triage on scene and make those decisions people go. And I think in those cases it had a direct impact on survival as well. Thank you, Donald.
Thank you very much. I now call David Torrance.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning to the panel. My questions are around triage, and quite a bit of them have been answered. The key role of the Scottish Ambulance Service is to triage a patient to the most appropriate hospital for their needs. And the Scottish Ambulance Service are guiding these decisions by a major trauma triage tool. Are the triage decisions and the MTTT subject to any kind of audit or evaluation? And I know you have mentioned staff before, but I'd like to hear from the panel members.
Peter Lindell.
Thank you, Liz. Yes, thanks, David. To answer the question, absolutely. We have the major trauma triage tool that has been provided and is, I suppose, based on other tools that are used around the globe and very similar to those. Once they go live, as you say, our paramedics will document decisions they've made using the tool on our electronic patient report forms in the backs of ambulances. So once they've made a decision, they'll key in how they made that decision, exactly which trigger on the tool caused them to make a choice of which destination. All that data is collected electronically and it's shared with STAG. And then we'll be, as you say, as soon as it goes live in the regions that aren't already live, we'll be collecting that data. Of course, we'll be looking to see whether the tool is sensitive enough, whether it over triages patients too often, whether it under triages any patients, and like I say, meeting with the trauma network to tweak the tool accordingly. So that's absolutely our intent.
David Torrance.
Thank you, Convener. Have the changes to triage improved patients' outcomes? And I know it has been mentioned earlier on, but can somebody expand on that as well, please?
Peter Lindell.
I think that would probably be something for STAG data to tell us, David. Of course, the triage tool has been live now in the north and east of Scotland networks for a while. But I suppose the difference in the north, though, is that the distances geographically between the different hospitals are so large that 45-minute triage for us doesn't make a huge amount of difference in where the patient will end up in the northern networks and eastern networks. I suppose the west network of all the regions is where we'll see a big difference in the places that patients are triaged to, and it'll probably be waiting to see the impact of that through the STAG data, to see what triage is making a big difference in patient outcomes. I don't know if anyone else from the panel wants to.
I'll maybe call Martin McKechnie.
Thank you, Convener. So, David, the answer to your question is not yet. We can't prove it because the network isn't fully live, but there is strong evidence from our overlapping clinical governance setups. So by that, I mean the Scottish Trauma Network clinical governance structure, the Scottish Trauma Audit Group, STAGS structure, and also the Trauma Desk at the Scottish Ambulance Service, their clinical governance structures. Now, we all overlap and we all feed into each other and we learn. And there is some evidence that the processes and times to treatments and times to CT scan for head injury and times to assessment and administration of, for example, anti-bleeding drugs or anti-infection drugs are having an effect on patient care. But the long-term results from a traumatic injury are by nature long-term. So we will see increased survival, but what we're looking for is the quality of that survival. And at the risk of sounding brutal, you will understand that a lot of trauma patients are young, and it is in the best interest of society that we rehabilitate and resuscitate them to the maximum so that they become functioning members of society again. So the bang for buck there in the long term remains to be proven, but I think it will be. But there's clear evidence that it takes about 5 years for that information to really begin to feed through. So if we're allowed to reconvene in 5 years, we could probably tell you that full story. But over the next few years, I hope that we'll begin to see the trends going upwards.
Thank you very much. That sounds like the term of the next session of Parliament by the sound of it. But I will now call on Brian Whittle.
Good morning to the panel, and I'd actually quite like to push a little bit further on outcomes, of course, because the creation of the trauma centres was there to hopefully to save additional lives. The STAG report has been mentioned, and within the STAG report there, the report is showing the mortality for trauma patients, and the report estimates that for 4 of the last 7 years, the number of actual survivors has been lower than the predicted number of survivors. I wonder if I could start off by asking how reliable the panel think the analysis of mortality is, and should be concerned by these findings.
Martin McKechnie.
Reliable in the context of what STAG reports, and that is patients who spend 3 days or more in hospital as a result of traumatic injury. I think I alluded earlier to the fact that there's an area of governance that hasn't ever really been explored, or it hasn't been joined up, should I say. And by that, I mean people who die at scenes, people who die very quickly after traumatic injury, information from the Procurator Fiscal's office and the police and other public bodies, which we have formed initial links and relationships with and we hope to be able to report in years to come about how those gaps are filled and perhaps give a more robust structure for the answer that you are seeking right now. But I think the evidence from our governance structures so far are that early interventions are improving patient care and that the training and education that we're putting in place is augmenting that.
Brian Whittle.
Thank you. Just if I could summarise there, are we saying that you will be able to analyse data to look at the factors that may be impeding survival, or may be able to explain away the initial STAG report findings? Have you got access to that kind of data?
Martin McKechnie, followed by Edward Dodson. Martin McKechnie.
Sorry, Convener. We have access to some of that information, as I said, and the additional information will come as our information probing extends. And part of that is the information manager that we've appointed, who will have access both across public health data, STAG data, and government data. So I think that picture will become clearer. The other aspect to that is that the governance structures that we set up are increasingly mature, increasingly refined, and I hope that will translate into very easily publishable data. But it does take some time until we come to the end of each patient's journey to prove that that was in fact effective.
Edward Dunstan.
Yeah, just going back to a previous question, the trauma triage tool is absolutely evidence-based, and we took a long time picking bits that were useful from other major trauma systems. But if you look at the English model, it was probably 5 to 8 years before they were able to demonstrate a robust improvement in care. And Martin's already talked about it. It's not just about survivability. That's not what we're dealing with here. This is a whole different picture. We're dealing with reducing disability, reducing the economic and social burden to that individual's family, and to society. It's a lot about reducing the psychosocial impairment. I've talked about reducing family disruption, reducing addiction, getting back an early return to work. You've got to remember that of critically injured people with major trauma, only 36% of people return to work, their normal place of work, within 6 months, which is why rehabilitation, which is a massive part of this project, is key. You've got to think about the reduction in tax revenue caused by major trauma. You've got to think about the increased benefit uptake by reducing major trauma. So by putting all these systems in place, we should be able to absolutely show not just the physical, psychological, but also the financial benefits of dealing with these patients in a scientific, evidence-based manner. One thing we never did in the South East before is gathered something called PROMs. That's called Patient Recorded Outcome Measures. This looks at the physical and non-physical well-being of an individual. As part of the key performance indicators, our KPIs, these now have to be gathered and they have to be presented, and they will come in through the STAG audit. We now have in all of our regions something called a major trauma coordinator. So this is a first point of contact for all of our patients that are injured. And this follows up, these individuals follow these patients up, not just in the hospital setting, but also after they've been discharged, to make sure they've got access to appropriate pain clinics, physiotherapy, rehabilitation, all those sorts of things. This really is a game changer. It is like night and day. The changes we've seen since 2017 have been quite extraordinary to the benefit of the population of Scotland, I assure you.
Thank you very much. Now, I'm conscious of time, so I want to move on now and call David Stewart.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning to all our witnesses. Could I move on to look at key performance indicators? How do you evaluate the results of each KPI and remedy poor performance?
Martin McKechnie.
scrutiny across various bodies that are involved within the trauma network. So the governance structures that I've described, with STAG as a crucial part of that. And if poor performance is identified via those sources, then it is my job to address that. But I'm happy to say that the integrity of all the people that work within this network means that I haven't yet had to yield any of that soft power, if you like, because any deviation from an accepted standard or a benchmark that does come up from this scrutiny, or of poor performance via the governance structures, is automatically and swiftly dealt with at regional level. That's really the answer to your question. It's internally governed, but with scrutiny from external structures who are overlapping with every aspect of the trauma network's function.
Thank you for that answer. I got most of that. Unfortunately, you're muted just at the start, but I got the drift of your answer. If my reading of the results are correct, I've looked at the charts comparing 2018 and 2019. Performance has improved across the board, comparing the 2 years, with one exception, and that was the time to undergo a head CT scan. Why was that?
Martin McKechnie.
We basically had parameters that weren't practical. The structures around CT scanning required a lot of, if you like, external input from the radiology services, reporting systems, and availability of scanners, which has part of our embedded KPIs. We want to get people within a CT scanner within very quick time of arriving at an emergency department. Not every department was set up in a way that allowed that to happen, but through various measures and collaborations with the radiology managed clinical networks, and as well as STAG, we have been able to refine those parameters and review some of the criteria based on clinical evidence that mandate CT scanning of the head at various points in the patient's journey. Part of that is a collaboration between us and our colleagues in radiology. And by that I mean X-ray and CT reporting. A lot of new investment, I think, has taken effect in the world of radiology, and that is now bearing fruit within the management of trauma patients. It's easy in major trauma centres and in lots of trauma units to get quick CT. It's not so easy sometimes in the more remote hospitals, but a lot of reporting and investment within radiography staff has since taken place, so that information is coming to us much quicker, which will ultimately be to the benefit of the patient based on for example, a neurosurgical decision for the treatment of their head injury.
David,
sorry, I'm getting a lot of echo here.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that was very clear. But so I can fully understand this, for the 2020 KPI, which obviously you compare with 2019, are you changing the goalposts in terms of what you're analysing? Are you keeping the same measure? And if you are, do you hope to improve in 2020's KPI compared to 2019?
So I would use the term refining rather than changing the goalposts. I know you'll appreciate that terminology, but it's based on clinical evidence. And also, I've alluded already to the pressure that perhaps I and our senior team put on the network not to drop our standards, to try and strive to achieve the highest and the best. So I am not surprised there have been some dips in performance. I expected that, but what I also expected was the rebound improvement in performance, which is now coming through.
Yeah,
thank you very much.
Thank you for that. I'm conscious for the convener's constraints on time, so perhaps I can just go straight to my last question, convener, which is, I think this may have been touched earlier, but has there been any significant increase in trauma from self-harm since the start of the pandemic?
That's been mentioned by one or two witnesses. I wonder if anyone would particularly want to.
Martin
McKechnie. Yeah.
The answer is yes, David. A lot of it is lockdown or pandemic related. People have struggled, and we have seen, unfortunately, a lot of serious, violent self-harm and harm to others. That has been, I wouldn't say an unpredicted, but a new feature of some of the cases that we're seeing during this last year. What I would say, though, in addition to that, treating the physical injuries of these patients has been part of the Trauma Network's remit. But as James Anderson, as a clinical psychologist, would state, the ongoing aftercare and rehabilitation of these patients is much improved now.
Thank you for that.
Very good to know. I am unfortunately conscious of time, and I think there will be some questions. I know there are some responses that I haven't been able to call, and I know there will be one or two further questions which I will direct to witnesses after the event. But can I move now to call George Adam for our final questions?
Good morning to everyone, and thank you, convener. I was interested in what Edward Dunstan has already mentioned about trauma coordinator's role, because he said it would be a game changer, and I agree. After reading about it, it seems to be something, obviously, as you've already said, rehabilitation is a long process, and someone coming to see you within 3 days of a hospital stay and creating an actual plan for rehabilitation of both at home and in hospitals, obviously a way forward. So 2 very quick questions, convener, if that's okay. How well received have the coordinators been to patients, who at the end of the day are the most important people, and could such a role be used for other services?
Thank you very much. Perhaps James Anderson would like to comment on those questions.
Very quickly again, convener, thank you. Very well received is the short answer in terms of the trauma coordinator roles. It is a major the experience of major trauma as a patient and a family is extraordinarily complex. The systems, the number of specialties are enormous, and having one face, one or two singular people who you can contact, who your family know and will speak to you when you're discharged, is hugely useful. Finding a way back into the systems, a single point of contact for the patient, reflecting in a way the single that Peter spoke about with the ambulance services, been very useful and very well received. And I think it does have some utility in other conditions where there are multiple specialties as well. And it's a model I think that we've had some interest in.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And can I thank all of our witnesses this morning for what's been a very comprehensive introduction for many members, and certainly report on the work of the Trauma Network and trauma centres across Scotland. There are a number of items where I think a number of matters where witnesses offered some further information following this session, and there will be other questions I think that we would want to explore further in writing and seek your cooperation in that. But thank you very much for your attendance today, and we look forward to, as Martin McKechnie described, a future report to Parliament on further development of the network. Thank you very much. We now move on to the next item on our agenda, which is an evidence session on the in relation to the provisional UK Common Framework on Food and Feed Safety and Hygiene. As we know from last week, the common frameworks are being developed to ensure that rules and regulations in given policy areas remain consistent across the UK following our exit from the EU, and our role is to scrutinise those common frameworks that fall within our remit. We have heard again on this framework from stakeholders, as we heard last week, and we are keen to hear also from the government. So I'm pleased to welcome to the committee for the first time in her new role, Marie Gougeon, Minister for Public Health and Sport, who is accompanied on this occasion by Ewan Page, Head of UK Frameworks in the Constitution and UK Relations Division of the Scottish Government, Jeff Ogle, Chief Executive of Food Standards Scotland, and Jennifer Howie of the UK Frameworks and Intergovernmental Relations Lead with Food Standards Scotland. Welcome to you all. And I look forward to hearing from you. I wonder, Minister, if you would like to make a brief opening statement in relation to the framework. Marie Gougeon.
Yes, thank you very much, Convener, and I look forward to working with members of the committee in my new role as Minister for Public Health and Sport. But in relation to the framework today, thank you for inviting me along to assist in your deliberations of the Provisional Common Framework for Food and Feed Safety and Hygiene. Now, officials from Food Standards Scotland have been involved throughout this process alongside officials from the Food Standards Agency in the rest of the UK. And as the committee is aware, the framework is one of a number of provisional common frameworks that will come before Parliament, and it's part of a programme which my colleague, the Cabinet Secretary for Constitution and UK Relations, has coordinated for our interest. And I'm therefore supported today by officials from both FSS and the Scottish Government. Now, this has been a hugely collaborative effort, and it demonstrates the genuine cooperation and engagement between UK administrations. And while the provisional arrangements are in place and we are now live, agreement to this framework on a formal basis would just help to ensure that those functions previously undertaken at an EU level are delivered in a coherent and robust way. And it would signal a formal commitment for each of the UK administrations to work together to deliver shared objectives. Now, I know that the committee has asked why you're only seeing the framework now and why it's not alongside some of the other frameworks relating to food. And that's simply a consequence both of the approach by consensus that we've agreed with colleagues across the UK, as well as wider pressures, not least the current pandemic. And I can assure the committee that the framework will not be finalised until all legislators in the UK have had an opportunity to consider it in full. But even in spite of that, excellent progress has been made in this framework, and it's one of the first to go before Parliament for scrutiny. And I consider that it will ensure that repatriated EU functions relating to whether that's general and specific hygiene and safety requirements for food and products and businesses, as well as others, will be delivered to a high standard. Now, this framework has followed agreed protocols for framework development, and it includes agreed UK processes for making policy recommendations to ministers, as well as governance and dispute resolution arrangements. And it's been developed in accordance with Joint Ministerial Committee for European Negotiations principles, which were agreed by the Scottish, Welsh and UK governments in 2017, and which the Northern Ireland Executive endorsed last year following its re-establishment. And that includes the principle that UK frameworks should both ensure the functioning of the UK internal market, as well as acknowledging policy divergence, and that they should respect the devolution settlements and the democratic accountability of the devolved legislators. Now, on that basis, we consider that this framework delivers against those principles which were agreed in 2017. And I hope that the committee found my reply to their letter of the 22nd of December helpful in answering some of your initial questions. And I would just be happy to take questions from the committee today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. And we do indeed have a number of questions following our previous evidence session and found your letter of December helpful indeed. Can I start by quoting from Paul Haggerty, one of the witnesses we've heard from on a couple of the frameworks? His concern was that while the mechanisms in relation to food and feed safety regulation and enforcement have developed organically over decades, it's possible that the UK may fail inadvertently to maintain those standards simply by failing to appreciate the full complexity of the process. Would you agree with that concern? Is that something we need to be vigilant about, and what would your view be of how these complicated and interconnected standards can be maintained going forward? Minister.
Thank you, Convener. I mean, I can absolutely appreciate the concern around this, because Professor Haggerty is absolutely right in that this is a very complex process. But what I would say is that it's not as if this is brand new to our regulators. I don't know if Jeff Ogle may want to come in on this after me, but this is a complex area that the likes of FSS and the FSA have been dealing with for a number of years. So while this may have developed organically over a number of years, it's the job of our regulators to be on top of all that, which they have been throughout that process. So I have every confidence in them moving forward from here. So, and I don't doubt for 1 minute that they don't appreciate the complexity of how this operates. But I mean, even in terms of the process that we've just been through, and I know the committee will be aware through all the SIs and SSIs that you've had to scrutinise, and that in government we've had to go through too. Now, we've retained EU law in full, and that obviously required a line-by-line analysis of food and feed law. And I'd say as a result of that, we're probably all a lot more familiar with those requirements now that we've since left the EU. But again, I would just come back to the point that while this may be complex, I do have the confidence in the framework that we've established that complex nature is appreciated. But I think that our regulators have been dealing with this for a long time, and they're more than capable of dealing with this as we move forward.
Jeff Ogle.
Thanks, Convener. Thanks, Minister. No, I'd agree with what the Minister has said. I mean, I think, organisationally, we have recognised the impact of Brexit, and we've increased our resourcing to deal with the consequences of Brexit. Certainly, I mean, the issue around international relations and ensuring that we maintain and work through those is going to be important, and we have been doing that since we started. And working with the Scottish Government Office, for example, in Brussels will be really quite important as well in keeping pace. We also have bilateral relationships with other member states, for example, Ireland, where I'm talking to the Chief Executive of FSAI later this week. So I think it's not lost on us the need to keep an eye on what's happening with EU law. And I think we've set ourselves up so we can do that. And as for the complexities of the policy, as the Minister said, this is not new to us. We've been dealing with EU law for some considerable time, and the conversion process itself. I mean, 95% of food law was EU law, and we've managed to translate all of that. So I'm quite confident we've got the capacity, capability, and the experience we need.
Thank you very much. I now call on Sandra White.
Minister and officials as well. Just a wee follow, and I've got two questions, and I was interested to hear that basically you have been following on EU law, and also there is some form of dialogue. What we heard from previous witnesses last week, they suggested the European Union, and the European Food Safety Authority ought to be consulted on this framework and other related frameworks as well. Now, I just wonder, Minister, whilst I've heard that you are consulting on EU law and you have been speaking to people within that vicinity, is there any further dialogue taking place in regards to consulting with the EU and obviously with the Food Safety Authority in Europe?
Minister.
Thank you. I mean, I can absolutely appreciate, and I know that point was raised in evidence that the committee had heard, but I would say that in relation to consultation with the EU institutions as to how we best manage intra-UK liaison and policy, I don't know if that would be entirely appropriate, and I think it's only right and fair that it's the administrations here that determine how that framework might operate. But of course, we would be looking to explore all possible avenues for maintaining that dialogue with the EU and its agencies as well. And one thing that we do know is that the UK will be cited on any opinions that are published by the EFSA for example, and that it's likely that for policy considerations that are impacting this framework area and many others, the UK-EU Joint Committee on Northern Ireland will be key to that too. And I would even say in more general terms that the EU will be forming its own view on how effective the new arrangements within the UK are for managing food safety, because the UK will be part of an audit process as a third country, and that's standard practice, and it will form another avenue of engagement with the Commission directly in due course.
Sandra.
Thank you. Can I just follow up on that one? It seems to me that obviously the framework, the UK, basically, and you mentioned there that the UK framework, they will be involved in that. So to go for consultation would mean that it would need to be the 4 nations, but we now know that it would just be the 3 nations because Northern Ireland, with the protocol, is not really involved in that particular issue. So if it was to push for, if we were the committee were to push or whatever, and advise on, speaking to the EU and obviously the European Food Safety Authority, would that need to go through the UK framework, or individual governments or states could take that forward themselves?
Minister.
Sorry, is that in relation to just in terms of consultation or how we would engage on specifically?
If say the Scottish Government, the Welsh Assembly, Northern Ireland would be separate from that, decided they would like to consult with the EU and obviously the European Food Safety Authority, would you be able to do that would we be able to do that as an individual state or country if Wales and Scotland or Northern Ireland wanted to do that, or would it need to be the 4 nations of the UK? Obviously,
well, I think that in relation to Northern Ireland are obviously part of this framework agreement as well. So I think that, that's what's important about the framework, because it's really essential that we have that opportunity for the 4 nations to come together as equals to discuss a lot of these issues. And it really builds on existing relationships that are already there. I know that there's a memorandum of understanding between the FSS and FSA. There's a lot of close working relationships there anyway, and that's really what this framework builds on and develops on. In relation to our engagement, we have our own Brussels office. We're looking to continue to engage and maximise all opportunities that we have for that. I don't know whether if the point you were trying to get at is, well, is that something we're able to do off our own back, or is that something that we would need essentially the permission of the other countries before we went and did that?
Yeah, well, basically, I was just asking if each individual country could do it themselves, or if it had to be jointly, if they wanted to consult.
Minister, do you want to? Shall I come in? I think just for clarity. I think the answer.
Oh, sorry,
the answer to the question is that both can happen. We've done both joint international engagement with the FSA, for example, that represents Wales and Northern Ireland as well as discussions on our own. So we are the competent authority for food and feed safety in Scotland, and we are able to talk about those issues particular to Scotland. Obviously, in the wider aspects, when it gets to trade, it's slightly more complex because that's a reserved issue. But certainly, my view would be that we can talk to administrations or organisations like EFSA in our own right, or we can do it jointly with FSA. And as I said, we've done both. So I think it depends on the issue, and it depends on the nature of the inquiry, and it depends on who is best placed to talk to.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Thank you. That clarifies my last question, Convener. Thank you. Obviously, we're talking about the common framework and how it works. Do you believe that the common framework and the new post-Brexit regimes offers adequate level of balance between risk assessment, risk management? Obviously, we're talking about novel foods, genetically modified. We now have the pesticide, which is coming forward, which has been in England. They're going to some form of consultation with pesticides as well. I'm concerned that these could sneak through if we don't have adequate level of balance and risk assessments. So could I ask what your opinion is on that?
Minister.
Absolutely. I mean, I do believe that the arrangements that we've agreed that they will ensure that there is that balanced view there. But I would also want to emphasise, I mean, I know that pesticides isn't an area that's going to be covered by this framework, but exiting the EU doesn't impact on essentially the fundamental principles of policy making in this area, because that policy will continue to be informed by the scientific evidence and other factors as part of that risk analysis process, and as well as all those processes that applied when the UK was required to consider its position in relation to developing EU policy as a member state. I know in the letter that I sent the committee in response to the questions that you'd sent me earlier in December, that included links to various papers that FSS had looked at and considered as part of their board meetings, and you know, they're responsible for the provision of policy advice to ministers on the matters that are covered by this framework area, and that also includes the detailed consideration of the risk analysis process, which includes looking at risk assessment and risk management as well as the communication of that. So again, I'd probably just reflect back to how I began the answer to this question, that I do think the arrangements that we've set in place through this framework means that the right balance is there.
Thank you very much. And I call on Donald Cameron.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning to the Minister and her officials. Following on from those questions from Sandra White, we described the new landscape of regulation, the common framework, the post-Brexit regime. Can I ask a sort of very general question, is that all the issues that might arise there, how do they impact on innovation in our food and drink sector, first of all? And secondly, do you foresee any consequences for human health?
Minister.
Well, I'd say that the key overriding interest in all of this is that public health is protected, and that's a key element for all of us going forward, and the focus on that. But I do think that obviously we do not want to see an impact on innovation within the food and drink sector, but I do think that the situation that we face right now, it's absolutely clear that businesses are going to have to adapt to the added friction that leaving the EU has presented us with. And I think for many businesses that might include the fact that they may have to invest to the EU directly rather than at home in order to continue to export to that market. And I think there's obviously, because of the added pressures on them with the increase in bureaucracy from leaving the EU. And I think it was just reported the other day that that's what the Department for International Trade had been advising businesses to do. So obviously we are concerned that the impacts that has on the food and drink sector and on their ability to innovate. But in relation to the framework and the arrangements there, that just really outlines how officials and ministers across the UK will really liaise on a lot of these matters that are within the scope of the framework. And so in and of itself, it shouldn't directly affect innovation. But again, by the very nature of the fact that we've left the EU and that added burden and bureaucracy that I talked about, I think that's what could have one of the biggest impacts in relation to that.
Unless Donald Cameron has a follow-up to that, I will call Emma Harper.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning, Minister, and good morning, everyone else. I'm interested in, I guess, some of the issues of the interoperability of the framework with Ireland and the Northern Ireland Protocol. Do you have any concerns regarding that?
Minister.
I would say that obviously there are some concerns there, but in relation to some of the responses that I've given to the previous questions, I mean, the framework is a 4-country agreement, and it's intended that we try and get as consistent and as an approach as possible between the 4 nations, but obviously it's also designed to help and it acknowledges the fact that devolved administrations should have the right to consider what's within the best interests of the countries that they represent and build in that policy divergence. But it's clear that if there are any changes to EU law, that would be required to be considered through the framework process, given, of course, that EU law will apply in Northern Ireland. And from the Scottish Government perspective, we've already set out our view that law in Scotland should be aligned with EU law, and we would want to align with that as far as possible where that's within our best interests. And the framework arrangement means that it's inevitable that any changes to EU law would be required to be considered in a UK context. But again, this is something that we are going to have to very closely monitor as we progress through the coming months.
Emma Harper.
Okay, thanks, Minister, for that. You mentioned divergence, which is interesting to me also, and Jeff Ogle said that FSA and FSS and EFSA all work well together anyway because the relationships have been built up over the years. But the divergence issue is interesting because divergence has always been recognised as legitimate where an administration could show legitimate cause. And in the response to the committee, it says that due to the relative size of production bases, this will mean that food law might be or will be determined across the UK as a whole in no small part by the administration with the biggest sectoral interest. Would that have an impact on Scottish producers if our market is obviously smaller than the wider English market or the UK-wide market?
Minister.
I think Emma Harper really raises a really important point there. And I mean, as I said in response to my previous question, we've already set out our view that the law in Scotland should be aligned with EU law as far as possible and where that's appropriate. So I think in terms of the possibility for divergence within that framework, I think Scotland itself may find itself in a better place with regards to providing necessary assurances to, say, auditors, for example. But ultimately, I think that would be a matter for the EU alone to determine. But again, we may be in a better position with that. But I think where the biggest concern for us comes from is, I mean, I've talked about the frameworks being allowing the ability for the four nations to build on existing relationships where we did work closely together with other agencies throughout that process, really building on that and working together as equal partners. The biggest threat to all of that, of course, is the Internal Market Act. You know, as members of the EU, when it came to mutual recognition, there were obviously the principles of subsidiarity and proportionality allowed for the divergence in respect for devolved policy making, and it's the Internal Market Act which is the biggest threat to that, and which could undermine the good work that we feel we could have achieved through the establishment and the frameworks.
Thank you very much.
Just one final question. Thanks, Convener. Just a final question. I've raised on many occasions in Chamber and in Rural Committee as part of looking at how we support the best produce coming into the country and making sure that divergence and safety of food is obviously is a key issue for me. And I've raised issues about the Food and Drug Administration in America have an acceptable level of defects handbook, which means that certain levels of contaminants that we wouldn't normally find as acceptable in our food supply chain is acceptable in the USA. Is that something that this common framework would be able to keep an eye on or be part of the way that we can scrutinise other trade deals when acceptable levels of defects are acceptable in some countries where we don't have an equivalent in the UK?
I'll call the Minister in a moment. Can I say to other witnesses, if you do wish to support the Minister with comments, then please enter an R in the chat box. Minister.
Again, the member raises a really important point, and that all plays back to the concerns that we have with the Internal Market Act and the fact that we could see whether that be food or, produced to other standards that we wouldn't necessarily accept here, but yet be forced to accept them because of what the Internal Market Act lays out. And it's an approach which, again, completely undermines the framework process that we have engaged with in good faith, and where it built on those positive existing relationships that we already have. But the Internal Market Act as well also legislates for problems that actually didn't exist. I think in all the engagement that we've had with the UK government over the past 4 years, not one area has been identified as a problem that this Act would address. So in a lot of ways, we just don't understand that we don't see the need for the Internal Market Act, and it really does undermine the work that we've done in good faith. And it's not a piece of good law. So Emma Harper talked about a specific example there, and to give an example, say, of what this framework would cover, if we had the market access principles within the Internal Market Act mean that if, say, we had a food additive that hadn't been authorised in Scotland, but it had been authorised in England, it couldn't be sold here. But say it was an additive that was added to bread here, that bread wouldn't have been produced in accordance with local law. So that additive could be sold in Scotland, added to bread here. We wouldn't be able to sell that bread in Scotland. However, if that bread was made in England using that additive, it could then be sold in Scotland. And likewise, a Scottish manufacturer could sell the bread they make back to England. So I highlight that example just to show the complexity within the Internal Market Act, and essentially how it doesn't really make for good law when we have now these complex problems to deal with. So again, I use that example just to highlight just one area where we could see some issues develop.
Thank you very much. David Stewart.
Thank you, Convener, and can I also welcome the Minister to the committee and to her new post for the first time, and good morning to our witnesses as well. Minister, I just have one question, which is about pre-market approvals and reauthorisations. You'll be aware that we have heard from the Food and Drink Federation Scotland, and they have real concerns that manufacturers will have to adhere to two regimes. That's the GB and Northern Ireland EU. Is this not likely to be detrimental to trade within the UK and from the UK to the EU?
Minister.
I would absolutely agree with that, and yes, and that's an area of huge concern for us, is really that impact on Scottish businesses who are supplying Northern Ireland, because the member's absolutely right in what he said. It's just simply a matter of fact that as a result of the Northern Ireland Protocol, businesses will have to ensure that they are, not just compliant with any regulations or law in the relevant part of the UK, but they will also have to be compliant with EU law if they're exporting to Northern Ireland. In fact, you've even just seen businesses over the course of the past couple of days, and smaller businesses in Scotland, who've simply ruled out exporting their produce to Northern Ireland purely because of that bureaucratic burden and the extra work that is put on them, which just isn't sustainable. And I think there is, of course, a further irony there too, because there is no mutual recognition. Any business wanting to trade with the EU has to meet EU standards, while the UK might be able to diverge for some markets. For the EU market, which is by far our largest, those EU requirements still have to be met. However, irrespective of any legal alignment under this deal, the friction that's being felt currently is really symptomatic of the UK status as a third country outside of the EU and Northern Ireland's status as set out in the Northern Ireland Protocol.
Thank you very much. And now call George Adam.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning to the Minister, and welcome to your new post, and I hope you do extremely well. You mentioned the Internal Market Act earlier on, Minister, and you said it was the biggest threat to the frameworks, and it creates a complexity that wasn't there before. How will the Internal Market Act interfere with how the frameworks actually operate? Can you tell me in more detail how that will actually impact?
Minister.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I would come back to and reflect to responses that I've given to previous questions too, because again, the positive parts of the framework are that they build on these existing relationships that I've talked about already. It's about the four nations coming together equally to really to manage divergence, respecting devolved competencies and respecting the fact that we may look to do different things and to try and manage that as best as possible. And that was an approach that the four nations had managed to agree. But we're absolutely clear that the Internal Market Act, which of course is now in force, that is a massive threat to the agreement and the implementation of the common frameworks, because the incentive to manage that policy divergence is completely removed if standards that are set in one part of the UK have to automatically be recognised in all other parts. And I think, as it might have been Emma Harper who had raised earlier, I mean, because of the relative size of the production bases too, that means that food law will be determined across the UK as a whole, in no small part by the administration that has the biggest sectoral interests. So, of course, that's of huge concern to us. Now, I know that there were late amendments to the Act to allow for disapplication of the Act's market access principles to individual legislative measures in common framework areas, but that decision can be applied unilaterally by the UK government. And I think we always come back to the fallback step of, it'd be the Secretary of State that would have the final decision on all of this. And again, it just removes that incentive for the cooperation that we really established through the common frameworks process. And they also undermine a key plank of the framework, and that's really that ministers can take decisions for their own countries. And at its very worst, it really just makes that whole process and that important process irrelevant. We consider that the common framework is all that's needed to make sure that internal market issues are considered in terms of policy development. I believe that there's the vast majority of stakeholders were in agreement with that process as well and felt the same. And our analysis of the Internal Market Act means that irrespective of the either the necessity or the proportionality of any public health priority in Scotland or indeed any other part of the UK, any national measure could be caught and again absolutely undermined by the automatic application of the Act's market access principles. So this is an area of huge concern for us, and we really feel it just undermines the process that we've engaged with in good faith.
Jeff Ogle.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, Jeff Ogle. Sorry, George.
Sorry, just 2 quick points. The first one, of course, is to recognise that in terms of divergence or the ability to diverge, this is not a new concept. It's actually been, it was a concept that was possible when we were members of the EU. So that's the first point. The second point is there is a history of the UK, even within the EU, of divergence in a range of policy areas, which have then been tried and tested in one area and then rolled out across the UK. So, take a non-Scottish example, for example, plastic bags in Wales, which was an issue there. It was then rolled out. Now, so I think there is a concern. I think that divergence is seen is a potentially bad thing and something that interferes with the internal market. And actually, in public health terms and a range of other areas, actually divergence is actually a good thing because it does enable public health improvements in a range of things that then may have wider application. And then the final point is the principle around the frameworks is it's a common framework. So divergence isn't an objective. Divergence, the recognition of the frameworks is about where it can be objectively justified and there's a rationale for it, and in this context a public health rationale for it, then the frameworks enable that. So I think it's just worth kind of reflecting those 3 points.
Thank you. George Adam.
Thank you, Convener. And it was just on the last point that the Minister made herself, and it's just purely for my own, just to get my own understanding here and everything, is basically we've been told how important the new Office of the Internal Market is. We've been told it's very important by people who think they're very important. So in that new office that's been created, how are Scottish interests actually represented in this office, and who would represent the Scottish interests?
Minister.
I would say that essentially this office, I mean, much in the same way as that I've spoken about the Act itself, we think it's completely unnecessary, and there's already existing structures there to gauge the market impact of any proposed new measures and to share that information between administrations and relevant agencies. So we see this as something that really isn't essential, and it's also an area that, I mean, the UK government, this is something that could perhaps have, if they've been willing to even look at, you know, sharing a chair, moving it around, but something that the UK government is very much held to itself to monitor and provide advice. And essentially, we just do not think that I would have concerns about how Scottish interests are going to be represented in that office, and I think that should be an area that, and questions too, that the committee should pose to UK government ministers as to how they will recognise our interests within that.
Thank you. I wonder if Ewan Page would like to add anything in that regard.
Thank you. Just to add to the Minister's points that the Act was amended to bring in some additional provision around the composition of the office in the internal market, including a requirement to seek consent as to Scottish specific appointments to the body. But if that consent is not forthcoming, UK ministers can proceed after a delay of 1 month. So there is very little in the body, very little in the rules that will oversee the composition of the body that will provide for certainty that there will be a reflection of views that in the views of Scottish ministers are rightly on the board. So just to add to the minister's earlier points, it is important not to overemphasise the idea that the Office of the Internal Market provides some kind of safeguard or means of working against the direct application of the Act market access principles.
Okay, thank you very much. And I now call on David Torrance.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, everyone. Minister, can I welcome you to your new position? And the committee heard from Food and Drink Federation Scotland that there is some concerns that manufacturers will have to adhere to two regulatory regimes. This is likely to be detrimental to trade within the UK and from the UK to the EU. Is there any early evidence of such impact, Minister?
Minister.
Yes, I mean, I think as I've previously highlighted too, that, you know, we've already seen businesses who have either given up on exporting because of the bureaucratic burden that's there, but that's where, you know, I would absolutely agree with the concerns that had been highlighted by the Food and Drink Federation, because, you know, and the impact that this is going to have and is already having on Scottish businesses who are supplying Northern Ireland. And of course, in fact, you know, and that applies to any trade that there is between Scotland and the EU, where that's routed through Northern Ireland too. And again, as I previously alluded to, you know, it's because of the Northern Ireland Protocol, businesses will have to ensure that they're compliant with two sets of legislation. You know, that's automatically a huge new burden for businesses to comply with. A number of small businesses have stopped trading, as I said, and I would hope that we don't see more of that. We see these relationships with Northern Ireland decrease and less people looking to trade there, but that is the reality of where we are at the moment because of the need to adhere to these two regimes.
Thank you very much. And I now call on Brian Whittle.
Thank you, Convener, and I just welcome to the Minister. I'm interested around the dispute resolution mechanism and written evidence. Professor Haggerty suggested that the framework repeatedly stresses that disagreements will be rare, and there is actually a lot of emphasis on goodwill and the desire for the nations to work together constructively. They also suggested that it was more likely that differences between nations will arise primarily in relation to risk management and the interpretation of the evidence. I wonder if I could ask the Minister if she would agree with Professor Haggerty that it would have been useful to stress test the likely effectiveness of that framework by exploring some of the difficult scenarios that are actually quite likely to arise.
Minister.
I mean, in an ideal world, we wouldn't be in this situation right now where we're having to really go through the process of testing this framework as a live process. And that ideally we would have been through the scrutiny and we would have had all of this in place by the end of the transition period. That was a situation that could have been avoided, but in a sense we are where we are, and yeah, ideally we would have done all of this and been prepared for that beforehand. But I think it would come back to some of the other points that have been made, and an earlier point that was made by Jeff Ogle. We're not starting this from the point of we're automatically going to diverge. That's not the starting point for all of this. We're already building on close working relationships that were there already, and building the framework on that. I talked earlier about the memorandum of understanding between FSA and FSS. So there's already a lot of ongoing relationships and communication right across the UK between all the interested organisations. So that's where I would hope that in relation to the dispute resolution mechanism there, that as has been laid in the framework, that I don't think we're automatically going to start out disputing everything. As I said, we're not starting from that and as Jeff said, we're not starting out from that policy of divergence. But we do have the process there should any issues emerge, and there's the processes there that would mean that hopefully they would be resolved at an early stage as possible. And again, that dispute resolution process would only be triggered as a last resort, and I know that every effort would be made to reach a consensus view on matters that are in the scope of the framework, which hopefully should mitigate against the risk of escalation to some degree.
Ryan Whittle.
Thank you. Finally, if I could, Convener, ask the Minister that the committee considers has a role to play as a conduit between stakeholders and the Scottish Government. Can I ask how you would keep the committee informed and the Parliament up to date with the implementation of the Common Framework and any changes to it, including proposals for related legislation as we go along this process?
Minister.
I suppose I just wanted that by saying that, essentially I really want to assure the committee that, I and the Scottish Government absolutely consider that there has to be effective parliamentary scrutiny of this, and I would be looking to keep the Parliament, the committee, updated and keep that flow of information going as much as possible. And I believe that between Scottish Government officials and Scottish parliamentary officials that discussion is ongoing about how we do that. But again, I think that one of the key ways in which the Parliament would be engaging with the framework would be through the decisions that the Parliament the Parliament will also be asked to take part in any decisions that, say, we take if we're looking to change any legislation. That would go through the normal scrutiny process. But again, I just want to reiterate as well that the frameworks that we have and that we're bringing forward are really essentially ways of working mechanisms between administrations, and their critical function is to deliver recommendations for any statutory change that we might want to implement, and it's those proposed changes that will drive parliamentary engagement with the framework. But of course I would be continuing to keep the Parliament updated, because I do think, as I said at the start of my response, that we need that effective scrutiny there.
Thank you very much, Minister, and thank you to yourself and to your officials for taking part in our session today. That's been extremely helpful to committee members, and we will be considering further response to this provisional framework in due course, and later indeed in this morning's meeting. Thank you very much for your attendance today. We now move on to the items 3 and 4 on the agenda, which relate to subordinate legislation, the consideration of made affirmative instruments. This once again relates to international travel in the context of the coronavirus, and on this occasion we have a total of 8 regulations in front of us today, which I know the Minister will describe in due course. What we're doing is that in relation to these instruments, we will have a single evidence session with the Cabinet Secretary for Transport, Infrastructure and Connectivity and his officials on the instruments, and we will then have 2 formal debates on the motions, one on the motions relating to the removal and addition of specified countries and territories, and ultimately the removal of all overseas countries and territories from the exemption list. We will debate those regulations together, and then secondly we will have a debate on the new scheme for pre-departure testing for passengers travelling to Scotland and those coming into the country. So let me once again welcome to the committee Michael Matheson, Cabinet Secretary for Transport, Infrastructure and Connectivity, who is accompanied on this occasion by Craig Thompson, Border Measures Review Team Leader, David Pratt, Policy Lead, Health Performance and Delivery Team, and Peter Brown from the Police Enforcement Liaison and Performance Team. Cabinet Secretary, thank you for joining us again today. And as you will have heard, we intend to deal with these matters in the way that allows us to ask questions on all the instruments at the outset, and then to have two separate debates on the separate areas. Cabinet Secretary, I think you may wish to make a short statement to introduce the regulations and describe their content. Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Convener. The regulations that the committee are considering today make a significant number of changes over a short period of time.
Indeed. That was a very short statement. Yep, carry on.
I'm sorry, I thought my system had frozen. Do you want me to continue?
Do please. Do please.
Okay. Sorry, Convener. Thanks. The regulations that the committee are considering today make a number of changes over a short period of time. The first instrument, which is SSI 20/444, was the last of the regular weekly country exemption changes of 2020. The four nations agreed to pause that process over the festive break with an emergency escalation route put in place. That was put into effect shortly before Christmas, with identification of a concerning variant in South Africa. SSI 20/474 therefore placed additional restrictions on travel from South Africa. These were the same measures used in response to the Denmark variant, including removing sectoral exemptions and requiring households to isolate. We then extended those additional restrictions to a range of countries in Southern African region within SSI 21/5. This followed further advice from the Joint Biosecurity Centre. Early in January, we were faced with a significant number of cases coming back from Dubai. We picked this up in the test and protect data for Scotland, and as well as our own investigations, we alerted the JBC on that Friday afternoon, and they began to look at the issue within the wider UK context. By Sunday, it was clear we needed to act in Scotland's interests in order to deal with the increasing numbers. And on the advice of the Chief Medical Officer, we took targeted action to remove Dubai from the exemption list. And this is dealt with in SSI 21/6. The GBC then convened a full risk assessment of the United Arab Emirates on the Monday morning and recommended that the UAE should be removed from the travel corridors immediately. We aligned with other nations to extend our existing targeted measures to take all of the UAE out of the exemption list. And this is dealt with in SSI 21/7. The SSI 21/19 is again about risk from new variants. A new concerning variant was identified in Brazil and Argentina. All four UK nations placed additional restrictions on travel from South America and Portugal based upon a risk assessment by the Joint Biosecurity Centre. The speed of these changes and the rate at which new variants are emerging meant that we had to look again at these existing processes. What the Joint Biosecurity Centre have told us is that the data is not available to allow them to adequately locate and assess the risk of new variants, and therefore the country exemption process is not fit for purpose. That led to the decision with SSI 21/21 to remove all countries and territories from the exemption list. Convener, the final part that these regulations deal with is the introduction of pre-departure testing. This requires anyone travelling to Scotland to have conducted a negative test at a maximum of 72 hours before they start their journey back to Scotland. And these will be checked by those operating any flights or any other form of transportation into Scotland, and will also be checked by Border Force at the point of entry coming into the country. These are provided for within the pre-departure testing and operator liability regulations, which are now in effect in Scotland.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. And we will now proceed to questions. Can I ask members of the committee who have questions to indicate in the usual way by placing an R in the chat box. Can I ask, first of all, what will happen, given the changes that have been made and the ending of the country exemption arrangements, what will happen in situations where citizens are stranded abroad? And what support will they be provided with, or what efforts, what actions will be taken to enable them to return in due course? Cabinet Secretary.
The requirement for any individual prior to, say, boarding their flight is that the operator is required to ensure that they have the appropriate certification of a negative test before they're allowed to board their flight. Should that individual not have that certification, they are not allowed to then proceed on to the flight, and the legal responsibility rests with the operator to ensure that happens. Should someone have difficulty, and there are some countries where there may be difficulty in accessing the appropriate level of pre-departure test, then there are some very limited exemptions within the existing regulations to take account of this. So it's important for anyone who is travelling, and of course anyone travelling just now internationally should only be doing so if it's absolutely essential. They should be making arrangements to ensure that they have access to a pre-departure test prior to returning. So it is incumbent on individual travellers to make sure that they have adequate arrangements in place to have that test conducted and completed prior to starting their journey back to Scotland.
For many of the regulations the committee considered in 2020, the question of enforcement was perhaps best described as light touch approach to enforcing quarantine arrangements or requirements that were put on travellers. Given the new approach, or given the tougher, I suppose, approach to travel in and out of the country in the current circumstances, I wonder what the Scottish Government is currently planning in terms of the enforcement of quarantine when travellers do return to this country in the next few weeks. Cabinet Secretary.
I think, Convener, you raise an important point, and it's an issue which we have already started to take action on. So, for example, if you were to look at the approach which has been taken by the National Contact Tracing Centre, is that anyone who's returning from a country which is viewed as being high risk, so for example South Africa or South America, then they are prioritised for being contacted once they return to the country, not only by email but also by being contacted by phone. Additionally, we're also looking at scaling up the number of individuals who are directly contacted once they return to Scotland. You'll be aware that we have been working on the basis of around 2,000 individuals are contacted each week by the National Contact Tracing Centre once they have returned to Scotland. We're now looking to scale that up, potentially looking at all individuals being directly contacted by phone once they have returned following international travel. The National Contact Tracing Centre have already started the process of ramping up their services. So, for example, just last week, they reached over half of all of those who returned to the country, which was a reflection on the increasing priority we are giving them on the need to contact those who are returning following international travel. and we're presently assessing what further additional capacity may be needed to ensure that everyone is directly contacted once they have returned. Secondly, we're also looking at what measures we can put in place to enhance compliance with self-isolation. That includes work we're taking forward in looking at the introduction of what is often referred to as quarantine hotels. And that's a measure which we've been in discussion with the UK government on, and we are presently assessing what we believe might be the most appropriate and most effective model to implement here in Scotland. And in addition to that, we're also looking to see whether we could use some form of technology to assist us to improve any periods of self-isolation that an individual has to complete at home. So, for example, we're looking at the existing Test and Protect app to see whether it could be amended in order to help to engage with individuals during the course of their self-isolation following international travel. So there's a range of work being taken forward to look at improving compliance and also to look at introducing further restrictions in order to ensure people are complying with any period of self-isolation.
Thank you. I have questions from Emma Harper, followed by Sandra White. Emma Harper.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Just a couple of quick questions, and one of them is that with pre-boarding checks as far as negative testing, does it matter if it's a PCR test or a lateral flow test? And my second question is about the quarantine hotels issue. Do we know why people don't comply, or why there's an area where people don't self-isolate? And then how would we then support that if we did move towards having quarantine hotels, for instance?
Cabinet Secretary.
So the specificity and the sensitivity of the test that someone requires to have completed for their pre-departure test is set out in the regulations. It's very close to being a PCR test, so many of the lateral flow tests will be insufficient because they are not sensitive enough, although there are some of the better quality lateral flow tests that may comply with it, but the specificity and the sensitivity of it is set out in the regulation, and it is very close to that of being the level that's specified within a PCR test. There's a higher threshold that we have set for these particular pre-departure tests. On your point around the use of quarantine hotels and why people don't comply with any period of self-isolation at the present moment, I think for many it will be on the basis that they probably think that they don't have any symptoms and that they don't pose any risk, and therefore choose not to comply with the regulations as they stand at the present moment. There can be a whole range of other reasons behind that as well. It may be work-related, or it may be family-related, that results in them feeling that they don't wish to comply with the regulations or can't comply with the regulations. However, what we have to recognise is that from the COG report that was published back at the beginning of December, the introduction of new virus into the country through international travel is a key issue that we need to address effectively if we are to continue to suppress the virus across the whole of the country. And therefore, that's why we're looking at measures that could enhance compliance, so through using things like the app approach, but also the introduction of quarantine hotels, because we know these are measures where they've been deployed in other parts of the world. They've proven to be very effective in ensuring that you get greater compliance and reduce the risk of importation of the virus. And that's why we've been engaging with the UK government in this matter. I'd like to get Four Nations agreement on this and to align it on a Four Nations basis. If we work on the basis of what we're hearing from the UK government at the present moment, I don't think it will go far enough, and it may be that we will have to take further measures specifically in Scotland in order to give us the satisfaction that it provides us with the safeguards that are necessary when it comes to the use of quarantine hotels.
Thank you very much. Sandra White.
Thank you very much, Convener, and thank you, Minister, for that. Very much supportive of the SSIs. I really think, I know we, the Scottish Parliament, we didn't have the powers to do this, but basically I think it should have happened a long time ago, considering international travel. and also the situation that we now have the new variants of the virus here in Scotland. I just wanted to go a wee bit further in regarding timescales for compliance isolation, and also do we have a timescale for the quarantine hotels? And in your ending of your comments to Emma Harper, you mentioned we may in Scotland have to take further measures if the four nations cannot agree. So could you give us an idea of what those further measures could be? I really, really believe that if we had locked down earlier with international travel, we wouldn't be in the position we are at the moment.
Cabinet Secretary.
Okay, in terms of compliance with quarantine overall, I believe this is an issue which the committee has considered before, and it is difficult to provide reliable data on the level of compliance with quarantine requirements where it involves self-isolation at home, because it is difficult to check on each individual, which is why we want to look at means by which we can increase compliance with any period of quarantine. And that's why we could look at we're looking at using quarantine hotels and also technology as a means to help to support that. On your specific point around the timescale for the introduction of any use of quarantine hotels, as it stands at the present moment, if we were to decide today that we are going to introduce quarantine hotels, it would probably take in the region of between 2 to 3 weeks for that to be operationalised. The reason for that is that it is dependent on the quantity and number of people who would be coming into the country that would have to make use of them. But also there is a particular challenge here in that we have a very low number of international flights coming into Scotland at the present time. So if we work on the basis of figures from last week, there are about 1,000 to say potentially 1,500 individuals who may come in direct flights into Scotland from international travel, largely from Doha and also from Dubai. However, there are an even greater number of individuals from Scotland who are travelling internationally and coming in through hubs such as Heathrow. And therefore, if they were required to self-isolate as a result of a restriction that we put in place in Scotland, that self-isolation would effectively have to take place at their point of entry into the UK, because it clearly would potentially be safe for them to travel from London to Scotland to carry out a period of self-isolation. So there are a number of operational issues that we would have to engage with the UK government on before we would be able to implement that. However, at this stage, it's unclear exactly how far the UK government intend to go. And I can only operate on the basis of what's in the press and the speculation around that, because they have not shared their details of their assessment with us, despite the fact that over a week ago, we agreed with them that we wanted to look at the introduction of quarantine hotels and to take it forward on a four nations basis. That has been disappointing, and that has hampered our ability to make sure that we can adequately engage in the decision-making process on what any final quarantine hotel arrangement could be across a four nations basis. Therefore, if the UK government don't go far enough in the way in which we believe it is necessary, it may be that we will have to take further steps here in Scotland around the use of quarantine hotels. And on your third point, Sandra White, the other areas which we are considering is that we are reviewing all of the existing sectoral exemptions in order to consider whether they remain justified and to consider whether some of those should be closed down altogether. And the other aspect that we are looking at is on the issue, as I mentioned, around how we can increase compliance with any periods of self-isolation and how those could be reinforced at points of entry into the country.
Thank you for that detailed reply, Minister. Thank you. Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you very much. If there are no further questions, I see no further questions from colleagues. We will now therefore move to agenda items 5 to 11 inclusive, which are the formal debates on 7 of the made affirmative instruments on which we have just taken evidence, those being SSIs 444 and 474 of 2020 and SSIs 2021 5, 6, 7, 19 and 21. First of all, are members content that we take a single debate covering all of these instruments together? Members are so content. Thank you very much. This, therefore, we move on to the formal debate process. There will no longer be questions as such, and officials will not speak, but members will have the opportunity to contribute to the debate. Can I invite the Cabinet Secretary to speak to and move the motions relating to these items en bloc? Cabinet Secretary.
Moved en bloc, Convener.
Thank you very much. Can I ask if any members wish to contribute to debate on these instruments? Sandra White.
Thank you very much, Convener. The reason I want to contribute to the debate is I won't reiterate what I actually said in my questions, but I am very, very concerned, and have been, not just me, but many other people too, the fact that whilst we would have 1,000 to 1,500 direct flights coming into Scotland, and hopefully we will go forward with the plans that they have, I have a real concerns in regards to flights coming into hubs, particularly coming into Heathrow and the areas down there. And I would really ask the Cabinet Secretary and the officials to press, and I know they will, with the Westminster Government, that this cannot be allowed to happen, that these flights are allowed to come in and go straight to Scotland without a four-nation approach in regards to isolation and perhaps, the hotels as well. We have to get a grip on this. We are now seeing these variants in the islands, in Scotland, from South Africa, from Dubai, from the Arab Emirates and from Brazil as well. This should have been done a long time ago to prevent travel of this COVID-19 virus. And I would reiterate once again that we need to pressurise Westminster into saying these people who are coming in via Heathrow must isolate there at the point of return. We can't have this virus spreading any further. People are dying and people are suffering terribly. We're having to stay in their houses. So I just make that plea in my contribution to the debate. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much. I call Emma Harper.
Thanks, Convener. I wasn't really planning on contributing, but just to pick up on the back of what Sandra White has said, we are speaking about airports and Heathrow and flying in, but there's also a concern that I have where people might fly into Dublin, for instance, which is in the EU, and then take a short drive to the ferry port at Larne and Belfast, and then a short ferry journey into Scotland. So I would be interested to hear about what work is being done and how we're working together with not only the four-nation approach, but also our neighbours in Ireland to make sure that we continue to protect people, especially as we're seeing these new variants arriving in our islands. So thank you. I think that's enough for me. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And there are no other members who have indicated they wish to contribute to the debate. Can I therefore invite Michael Matheson to sum up and respond to the debate? Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Convener, and I'm grateful for the comments that have been made by Sandra White and Emma Harper. In dealing with Sandra White's concerns around the issue around hubs such as Heathrow and the risks associated with the new variants, my principal concern at the present time, from what I can see in the press that the UK government are considering, is that they are considering the use of quarantine hotels being targeted at those individuals who are returning from what is viewed as being high-risk areas where new variants have been identified, namely South America and southern parts of Africa. The challenge with that approach is that the Joint Biosecurity Centre have been quite clear is that they are not able to assess and advise upon where those high-risk areas are until the new variants have been identified. Therefore, the system, in my view, would only offer very limited additional protection, which is why we believe that the use of quarantine hotels needs to be extended to a larger group of people who are returning to the country, rather than just those who are returning from what are viewed as being high-risk areas. But it's unclear to us as yet what methodology or approach the UK government intend to take, if that is the approach they take on the use of quarantine hotels. We will have to wait and see what information they provide us with on their own assessment. In relation to Emma Harper's point around the Republic of Ireland, I can assure the member that the discussions which are taking place on a four nations basis are also looking at matters relating to the common travel area, which includes the Republic of Ireland, and it's an issue which has been raised on a number of occasions by my counterpart in the Northern Irish government on the transferring of information between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland on any passengers that may be travelling through Dublin. So there is an issue which is being pursued there at the present time to try and address the type of concern that Emma Harper has raised.
Thank you very much. Can I confirm that members are content that a single vote be held on these 7 motions? We are so content. The question then is that motions S5M 23757, S5M 23812, S5M 23887, S5M 23886, S5M 23851, S5M 23922, and S5M 23897 be approved. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Thank you very much. Those motions are agreed. We now move to agenda item 12, which is the formal debate on the remaining additional made affirmative SSI in which we have just taken evidence, which is SSI 2021-20, the pre-departure testing and operator liability regulations 2021. Once again, this is a debate and not a question session. If members wish to debate, they should indicate by placing an R in the chat box. And can I invite the Cabinet Secretary to move motion S5M 23921? Cabinet Secretary.
Moved, Convener.
Thank you very much. I see no members who wish to contribute to debate on this item. The question, therefore, is that motion S5M 23921 be approved. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Thank you very much, and thank you to the Cabinet Secretary and his officials for your attendance at this evidence session. Thank you very much. We'll report to Parliament accordingly. We now move to agenda item 13, which is consideration of 3 public petitions and the request from the Petitions Committee that we conclude on those, and members will have seen their request for any outstanding petitions to be considered and disposed of by the end of this month. And we have 3 outstanding petitions that remain on the desk, so to speak, of the Health and Sport Committee. Those are petition PE 1568 on funding, access and promotion of the NHS Centre for Integrative Care, PE 1605 on whistleblowing in the NHS, a safer way to report mismanagement and bullying, and petition PE 1710, Community Hospital and Council Care Home Services in Scotland. Now, it may be that colleagues want to address individual petitions. At the same time, there is we should acknowledge, I think, that this is the very end of the parliamentary session, or we are approaching the end of the parliamentary session, and therefore this may be an appropriate time to discontinue consideration of petitions from this session. Clearly, some of them raise issues which may be brought back to Parliament by petition in the next session, but perhaps in a way that is more up to date than the ones that are before us. I see Emma Harper.
Thanks, Convener. Just want to note and make sure that we actually have on record that the Petitions Committee, my understanding is they're reviewing the process for presentation of petitions to the committee, and so in the next parliamentary session I think there might be a process that will be different from current. So it's just to raise that, as in just to make sure that members are aware, so that at this point we might be able to close some of these petitions, and if in the future there are questions that still need to be answered, that the process for doing that might change.
I think that's a very important point, and I think it is indeed reflected in what we have seen from the Public Petitions Committee and their suggestion that we should dispose of petitions now in order that the successor committee will have a clean sheet and be able to address issues with new petitions in the new parliamentary session. I see Brian Whittle.
Thank you, Convener. I think my concern, having been on the Petitions Committee for a number of years, it's always been that a petition can be carried forward into the next session, and as Emma Harper says, they're looking currently just now whether that's the case. I just wonder, obviously I've had a note in from regarding Catherine Hughes's petition and the Chronic Pain Cross-Party Group. The agreement was a unanimous agreement that they didn't want to close that, and I wondered what would be the implications of that, and will they have the opportunity, if we didn't close that, will they have an opportunity within this session to make any further progress? That's really the crux of the matter here, Convener.
It is, and I think the short answer to your last question is it's very unlikely that this committee will have further consideration of any outstanding petitions this session. As members will know, we are rapidly approaching the end of the session, and a number of items of business still to be dealt with by the committee. So the implications, I think, would be that it is open to this committee now to close these petitions, and it would be open to petitioners with or without support from members of Parliament to bring petitions, a new petition forward in the new parliamentary session, covering any aspects of a previous petition which they feel have not yet been addressed. And I think that would offer, certainly for the future Petitions Committee, a tidier way to deal with matters, and for petitioners, hopefully something that's more up-to-date and relevant than perhaps petitions may be after they've been lying on the table for some time. I see David Torrance.
Thank you, Convener. I was just going to agree with you there fully. As a member of the Public Petitions Committee, time is very short for the committee, and it would allow petitioners to bring it back in the new Parliament session, and probably more updated, and allow the Petition Committee to look at it again. So I fully support what you're saying.
Thank you very much. That is clear and appreciated. We should therefore now move to formal consideration of the proposal that we agree to closing each petition. Can I start with petition PE 1568? Are we agreed to close this petition? We are agreed. Petition PE 01605. Are we agreed to close this petition? We are agreed. And finally, petition 1710. Are we agreed to close this petition? Thank you very much. We will therefore report back to the Public Petitions Committee that we are not going to consider these petitions any further, and look forward to hearing in due course what new arrangements will be put in place. The committee will now move into private session. I suspend this meeting, and we will resume on a different platform in 2 or 3 minutes' time. Thank you very much.